Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about A-bar extraction in Tagalog. It's a well-worn topic, but I'm hoping to provide a new perspective based on some novel and not so novel data. Okay, so just an introduction. Really quickly, Tagalog, as many of us know, has a well-known restriction on A-bar extraction that favors a syntactically prominent argument clause. In this talk, I'm going to be calling it the pivot. So this is typically one per clause, bears nominative marking, and co-varies with the voice form of the verb, so that's shown in one. Right, we have the agent voice with the agent pivot, and the theme, the patient voice with the theme pivot. Okay, so the typical understanding of the pivot-only restriction is that only the pivot of a clause is the valid target for A-bar dependency formation, and so that is shown in 2A. Right, if we want to extract the agent, we need to use the agent voice form of the verb. Whereas if we use the same form of the verb, the theme is not extractable. To do that, we need the patient voice form of the verb, and that's shown in 2C. Okay. A common intuition behind a lot of the work on this topic is that the reason why you get this kind of preference is that the pivot is the structurally highest argument, often lying outside of the VP phase. And that's what privileges it for A-bar extraction. So we often get configurations like what we can see in 3 and 4, right? Where we have the agent is the highest in AV configuration, or in a non-AV configuration, something below has moved up higher for whatever reason. Okay. And the result then is that analyses propose more or less that either the higher argument is the closest to the A-bar probe, and so that's the only valid argument, or maybe that the extraction of the lower argument causes licensing problems. Okay, here I'd like to point out that in a lot of the literature, the VP phase is sort of rather prominent, but if we sort of look at it more closely, really what's crucial is this relative height difference between the two DPs. That's what's causing that's what's proposed to cause the extraction restriction. Okay. In this presentation, I'm going to take a different tack and claim that actually what blocks certain DPs from being accessible to A-bar extraction in Tagalog is the VP phase or something like it. And hedging here a bit, we'll see why later. Rather than the presence of, rather than kind of the height, the absolute height of the DPs. So two corollaries of this claim are one, that any DP that escapes this phase can undergo A-bar extraction, and I'm going to claim that that's what's happening with pivot extraction. And two, here is something relatively new, is that eliminating the phase boundary allows free extraction. So I'm going to show in this talk stuff to, in this talk, I'm going to talk about the second point here. So the abstract kind of overpromises for a 20-minute talk. So in particular, I'm going to argue that the absence of inflectional structure renders the domain of theta role assignment transparent to A-bar extraction. And to see this, we will be presenting two kinds of data. First, I'm going to analyze I'm going to use this analysis to account for previously noted behavior with the recent corrective form. And I'm going to be talking about novel evidence from exclamative adjectives. And so just a note that in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on relativization. Okay. Some background. I'm going to talk about extraction of pivots. Okay, so here I'm going to first present the analysis as applied to the classical examples of pivot extraction. And to do this, I'm going to propose this functional head Agar, adopting the label from McGinn, 1988. I'm going to propose that this head is spelled out as the Austrian region voice morphemes, in, an, and e, and that a single specifier position of this functional head hosts the pivot. Furthermore, I'm going to argue that Agar is merged outside of little VP, and so the pivot necessarily moves out of little VP, thus allowing it to undergo A-bar extraction under the proposal that I stated a few slides ago. Something to note is that this, right now, what I'm going to present is not distinguishable from the highest DP approaches that we talked about in the introduction, as the pivot DP is the highest argument. It's going to end up being the highest argument, but stay tuned. Okay, so how does this analysis work? So let's take an example like 5, the book that the woman will read. So this is a theme relative clause with a patient voice verb. And I'm going to assume a structure something like, I'm going to propose a structure something like in 6, right? where we have the little VP having a relatively typical structure. And since we're doing a theme relative clause here, the theme argument is a null operator, which bears a pivot feature, which I'm proposing is what facilitates the movement to the spec of agar P. Right. So with this configuration, what we have is that we have one DP that's outside of the little DP and one DP that remains inside of the little DP. And I'm proposing that this is what gets us the possibility of 5 and the impossibility of what I've shown earlier, of the impossibility of an example that I haven't shown here, in that the agent is not accessible in its base position. So with just this structure, agent extraction should not be possible. Okay. Let me talk more about agar, in particular to kind of justify kind of where I put it and where I put it in the structure and what I claim it does. Okay, I argue that agar spells out the Austrian region type voice morphology as a reflexively similar in spirit to previous analyses by Henrison Hsieh and Victoria Chen, and I've listed out the relevant morphemes here just for clarity. And I argue that agar is the source of nominative in the clause. In particularly in verbal constructions, we see that the presence of the nominative marked pivot is determined by the presence of voice rather than the presence of tense or aspect. So we see that in 7 and 8, right? If we look at 7, the matrix verb and the verb in the embedded in the adjunct clause both have a voice. Here we have AV and here we have CV, but they differ in whether or not they have tense. So here it's perfective, but here there's nothing, right? But in both cases, we have a nominative pivot, right? Now compare that with 8. We have here a gerund construction at my feeding of the cat. And here we see that this construction has certain kinds of argument introducing morphology, which I assume to be spellouts of little v, but lacks any voice specifications or aspect specifications. And correspondingly, we have no nominative marked argument, right? So that's my evidence for agar assigning nominative in Tagalog. Furthermore, what about the position of agar? So here I argue that the co-occurrence patterns in different environments suggest this particular hierarchy where T dominates, agar dominates V. In particular, we can see in this table, if we break down the forms, these are kind of 3 representative patterns that we find in Tagalog, right? We can have fully inflected forms, which have T, agar, and V. So here is a lexical causative or transitivizing morpheme, if you're based on work from, for example, Lisa Travis. And here is the causative morpheme. On the other hand, we have going down on the next row, we have an aspectless form. Here we lack aspect, but we have both agar and little v. And 9 shows that in environments that select for this form, aspect is indeed not allowed. Finally, we have the most reduced kind of form. Here an example is shown with a gerund form. And this form lacks both tense and agreement. But can have these kinds of argument introducing morphemes. And 10 shows that in such environments, so here is a kind of a fully loaded gerund, if you will, but you can't have any of voice or tense or aspect on here. Okay, so that motivates this particular hierarchy that I have here. Okay, so far what we have is I've sketched an analysis of the classical pivot extraction effects where the DP must move out of the theta domain to be accessible to higher theta A bar probes. And so the result is that the pivot movement feeds A bar extraction. On the other hand, non-pivot DPs remain within the little DP and are therefore inaccessible. In other work, I extend this feeding approach to account for other kinds of, so to speak, unusual extraction, including non-pivot agent extraction and possessor sub-extraction, by proposing that a second kind of feeding movement is available that I call genitive inversion. We'll see some examples of that later, but I won't go into it in detail in this talk. Instead, I will provide evidence for the activity of the proposed boundary, the proposed, so to speak, phase, and show that it becomes inactive when the inflectional layer is absent, therefore rendering feeding unnecessary. So we'll see this in two ways. First, we'll see freer extraction in the recent perfective construction, and we'll see asymmetrical behavior among exclamative adjective constructions. Okay, so now the recent perfective form. Okay, so here it is shown in 11. Here is the recent perfective form. We see that it's marked. We see that there's a verbal root marked with the prefix ka with some reduplication, and there's also this clitic adverb lang. And this, roughly speaking, this form conveys some kind of recent completion of an event. So here, the student has just bought pants. Notice that there are no reflexes of agar. So recall that agar assigns a nominative case, and so we find that none of the arguments of this clause has nominative case. And there are no recognizable voice morphemes, so none of the 4 that I listed out here. So the question, naturally, that when one maybe first encounters this form is it possible to extract A-bar arguments out of this type of clause? The answer, as it turns out, as has been pointed out previously, is that all VP arguments can extract from this form, and that's shown in 12A and B. So we can have a student that has just bought pants, or pants that the student has just bought. So both the agent and the theme can be extracted. And so what we have is something that seems maybe paradoxical in that the absence of pivot movement seems to lead to freer extraction. So what's going on here? I'm going to propose that the absence of inflectional structure in the respective construction allows A-bar probes to actually target all VP internal DPs, right? So what is the inflectional structure, right? Recall, for example, that there are no reflexes of agar in this form, right? There's no pivot and there are no voice morphemes. So that's one piece of evidence. Furthermore, we have what looks like a lack of aspect. So right, despite the meaning that the form contributes, we have no evidence morphologically that any of this is aspect morphology, right? So for one thing, we have this ka morpheme. If you break down the morphology, we have this ka morpheme, right? That does not appear anywhere in the regular aspectual paradigm here on the left. And if we look at CV reduplication, right, we see that both appear, but the semantic contribution is different. So right, in the regular aspectual paradigm, it contributes some kind of non-completedness to the meaning, and that is at odds with the recent perfective form. Okay. Finally, further evidence of this kind of reduced nature of this form comes from sort of what looks like a defective left periphery. So as you see here, we have, for example, negation is unavailable, right, for some reason. So we can compare A, which has the fully inflected verbal form, and B, which has the recent perfective form. We see that the negation is not possible with the recent perfective. And furthermore, we have genitive inversion. This is a process by which a genitive clitic pronoun can appear actually in front of preceding the verb with some extra changes in the form and extra morphology. But we see that with the fully inflected form in A, right, inversion is possible, but it's not in B. Okay, so what's going on with the recent perfective? Here's an example in 15 of a theme relative clause, right? So that's basically the most embedded DP possible, and you see that the extraction is fine. And so I assume a structure like this in 16, right? So as previously mentioned, the recent perfective lacks structure from the inflectional domain. So there's no agar P and there's no TP, but VP is still possible. That's evidenced by the fact that you can have causative. And I'm going to assume for concreteness that the morphology associated with recent perfective is spelled out in this head tel, which is short for telic. There's a note here about where else we might be able to find this morpheme. And I'm going to claim that tel t is the extent of the functional structure for recent perfective. And so what we have, if we have just this structure, right, all DP arguments are going to be accessible, even though none have or none can evacuate the little VP by other means, such as with pivot movement or genitive inversion. Okay, so what have we seen so far? We've seen two ways that A-bar extraction in Tagalog can proceed. First, but via feeding movement, right? So this follows some intuition from previous work in that a high position of the pivot facilitates this extraction, but the formalization is different in that what the crucial point is that the crucial factor is to escape the VP itself. And I propose that pivot movement is one way of doing this. The second way is to eliminate the inflectional layer. And so this is to basically use to have various constructions that lack this layer. So I just argued that recent perfective, the recent perfective form is such an environment that lacks a layer, that lacks this layer. And we'll see further support from exclamative adjectives. Here we'll again see that there's no evidence of the feeding movement described in one. But interestingly, we're going to see some asymmetry that shows that we'll see some asymmetries in the availability of extraction, which will correlate with the presence of inflectional structure. Okay, now on to the last part. Let's talk about adjectives and exclamatives. Okay, just some baseline background. Here are some facts about regular adjectives, plain positive adjectives, right? These assign when used predicatively, so as in 17, these assign nominative to their subject. So here we have ang bata. And for the class we're concerned with, the so-called anergative adjectives based on borrowing Saba's terminology, these often have this ma prefix attached to them, right? As we see in 18, 18 shows an example of adjectival modification, and in fact, this kind of modification is hard to distinguish from relative addition in this language. In particular, there's no specialized morphology found in one but not the other, and we have a similar behavior relating to relative ordering of the head noun and the modifier. So we can actually treat this. I'm going to assume for current purposes that we can treat this as something like child who is good at painting, and maybe we can also do something like good at painting child. Okay. What about exclamative adjectives? So there's two ways in which these are different from the plain positive ones that we saw earlier. First is that they bear this different prefix form, right? So the root stays the same. The gloss here is wrong. The root stays the same, but we have a different set of prefixes. You can have napaka, kai, ang. And the second difference is that we have a genitive marked subject, right? So there's no nominative marked thing in this entire clause, right? Interestingly, 20 shows that extraction is possible with napaka and kai forms, but not with the ang form, 20A versus 20B. So what's going on here? I'm going to claim that the observed patterns with exclamative adjectives are explained by the presence or absence of adjectival inflectional structure. But before that, let's kind of make sure that we're not sort of the facts can't be explained some other way, such as with feeding movement, as we argued earlier for pivots, right? So on one hand, we see that there are some parallels with recent perfective. On one hand, there is no pivot movement, as we have seen. So exclamative adjectives have no nominative argument. And second of all, they also don't have any kind of genitive inversion. So that's shown in 2021, right? We can't basically prepose this pronoun here to the front, and 21B just shows a slightly different version of it, just to be sort of complete for completeness sake. Okay. So then the implication here is that A-bar extraction cannot be fed by movement out of the domain of favorable assignment. And so the phase boundary must be missing in some cases, but not others. So I'm going to claim that the difference in where we find the phase boundary is tied to the presence or absence of inflection. Okay. Let's look at inflection, right? Inflection, what I want to talk about inflection in adjectives. There are two processes at least that we can look at. First is optional plural agreement. That's marked with CV reduplication. That's shown in 22A, right? When you have a plural subject, you can have this optional CV reduplicant in the adjectival form. And there's a bit of funny stuff going on with the stars, but 22B just shows that if you have a singular, you can't do this agreement. Second of all, we also have bisyllabic reduplication. Here in this case, we see that it does some kind of softening. So soup is still hot and the soup is still somewhat hot. So kind of in accordance to what I claimed earlier, we see in 24 that both plural agreement and bisyllabic quadruplication aren't available for these forms. So you can't do CV or bisyllabic quadruplication if you have napaka or kai on the stem. So that's shown in 24 and in 24. But on the other hand, when we look at the ang form, both are instead possible. So plural agreement is possible. That's shown in 25A. The students are so smart. And we also get some kind of bisyllabic quadruplication, although the meaning is different here. There's some kind of emphasis. So we can have the students are so smart. It's a little hard to quantify what exactly is emphatic about it, but that's the intuitive. The intuition is that it is somehow emphatic. Okay. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip this slide. But if you're interested in evidence that this is not actually just a plain DP that's used exclamatively, please look at 26. Okay. So what is going on in the structure? So here I'm going to adopt Sabal's structure for adjectives from his thesis, where A is the adjectival root, and we have a structure that's parallel to little VP here. Here it's little AP, which introduces the adjectival subject that's here marked with a DP. Okay, and so we have kind of three different cutoff points that we can have. First, when we have a napaka and the kai exclamative, we have structure up to AP, little AP. Here we have no inflectional structure, and so I argue that the in situ operator here is accessible to an A-bar probe, thus allowing us to get extraction out of these forms. On the other hand, if we move one step up, we have ang exclamatives, and I'm going to assume that these have structure up to num-p, which I take to be representative of adjectival inflection. So including this inflection layer renders the little AP opaque to extraction. So that's on one hand. And on the other hand, there are no feeding movements that can get the operator out of little AP, and so the effect is that the operator is trapped and extraction is not allowed. Finally, if we move one more step up, we have plain positive adjectives, which I assume include agar P. So in this case, little AP is still opaque to A-bar extraction, but because we have pivot movement, we can move, the operator moves out of the little AP. And so this movement is what allows A-bar extraction to proceed. So we can get full adjectival modification. Okay, some summary and discussion. So what have I shown today? The main claim that I put forward today is that the domain of theta assignment is accessible to A-bar extraction in Tagalog. And that and this results in two things. First, DPs must escape this domain to be accessible to the A-bar extraction. And number two, this domain becomes transparent in the absence of inflectional structure. So we saw that in the verbal domain, fully inflected forms require pivot movement to get extraction, and there's no extraction possible for in situ DPs. So these are the non-pivot DPs. Whereas recent perfective forms that lack inflection allow free DP extraction. On the other hand, we saw in the adjectival domain, we have this number of exclamative adjective forms that lack this feeding movement that is required by one. But they differ on whether or not they exhibit two, in that with napaka and kai adjectives, we saw that they lack inflection, which correlated with accessibility of the in situ DP argument, whereas with ang exclamatives, the reverse was true. Okay. Now, just looking beyond, you can ask a few questions. First, what is the nature of this opacity? I've left this kind of sketch, admittedly very sketchy at this point. And so the question here is, why does the presence of the inflection layer render little VP or little AP transparent? If we were going for a phase-based approach, we might tie this maybe to the time of spell out. But there is an additional wrinkle in if we look at kind of extraction more broadly in Tagalog. And so notice that I only focused on DP extraction in this presentation. And that's because there are major differences in the structure and locality signatures of these two kinds of extraction that make a phase-based approach difficult. And you can ask me more about this in the question period. And finally, something that I would like to do is to look more closely at the structure of adjectives in Tagalog, in particular, just to be able to fully ascertain their structure and kind of confirm the claims that I've made in this talk. Okay, thank you.
All right, so there are around 5 minutes for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or ask in the chat. So Matt Pearson.
Thanks, and thanks for this talk. Can we go back to the tree in 16 on slide number 14? So this is the structure that you're assuming for the recent perfective. And so I guess the main idea that you're working from is that when little VP merges with a head that sort of counts as part of the inflectional structure, that kind of turns the little VP into something that's, I don't want to say opaque for extraction, but you can only extract the highest thing in that situation. So if this Ka plus reduplication is in this telic head, then that head can't count as part of the inflectional structure. Otherwise, the whole thing breaks down. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of what is a sort of principle for determining whether a head external to little VP is part of the inflectional structure or not.
Right. I'm not sure that I have a more general way of telling, but at least for this telic head, we kind of see. So we see it in different forms in that. How do I phrase this? There's something about at least so in the verbal cases, there's something about agar that I think is probably important in that it gives us the nominative case and also the voice morphology, and I think that is the cutoff point. And so for this for the telic head, or at least the morphology that I'm claiming is in the telic head, the fact that it shows up in a bunch of other constructions, in particular other kinds of gerunds, which I've also argued are reduced, or this kind of smaller kind of construction, and also in some senses it's been argued also that in these kinds of non-positional or implicative verb forms that the ka is actually some kind of has to do with assigning theta roles or something like this, and introducing arguments. So I think it's going to be, the cutoff point is going to be something relating to introducing arguments or assigning theta roles, I think.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, next up we have Dan Kaufman.
Hi, Henrison. Thanks for an interesting talk. I was just curious that you seem to be treating the ang and the exclamatives as totally unrelated to the ang as a case marker or determiner. Yes. And I mean, I think that maybe, I don't know if that can really be justified, because you find that the ang, whatever ang is in other languages, is also used for exclamatives in other Philippine languages.
Right.
You also find that extraction from a ang phrase is very restricted, and so you would expect this kind of differential facts that you find between ang and the other exclamatives. And then you also find cross-linguistically there's it's pretty typical to use nominalizations as exclamatives.
Yeah. So that is a concern, and at least one way that I have convinced myself that is maybe less of a concern, maybe in Tagalog, is that if we look at 26, actually if we compare the behavior of the ang exclamatives and to things that are unambiguously GPs, we find differences. So in particular, we can't do these inflectional, this inflectional morphology can't appear on something that's a true VP. So you can't do, the intelligence. So right. The idea would be that, maybe this is something like, the students, the intelligence of the students, something like that. But you didn't have to explain why stuff like the plural or the bisyllabic reduplication is possible in this form, but not in this form.
Right. But maybe you want to find a compromise that gets the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
All right. I'm sorry, Matthew, but we're going to have to move on to the next talk now. Thank you again.